The depot is on fire and the shaheds stored there have been destroyed. Moscow and St. Petersburg are under attack. We'll discuss all of this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svetan. Right now, Moscow and St. Petersburg are under attack. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health.
Roman Grigorievich, well indeed, we're now starting to strike very intensively. That means we've destroyed or severely damaged as much as possible the helium plant in Orenburg. This is the only facility in Russia that produces a critical component for missiles. How much could this impact the Russian missile program and defense industry?
Well, it will definitely reduce production, although they do have a sufficient number of laboratories where helium can be produced, including on an industrial scale. So now they can switch if there is a certain critical shortage specifically of helium. But there's another aspect here. This plant processed 15 billion cubic meters of gas per year. That's the main point. So the attempt to shut down the gas processing plant, if it succeeds, and I think it will, if not the first time, then the second, will make it possible to expect that the Russians will at the very least have to shut down their gas wells. They simply won't have anywhere to put the gas. What does that mean? 15 billion cubic meters? Ukraine consumes 15 billion cubic meters for its own needs at this point in time. Well, up to 20 when we were at full. Right now, it's about 15 billion cubic meters that we consume. So that's the consumption of an entire country by a single plant. If you strike it, then at the very least, first of all, they don't receive a certain amount of petrodollars, so-called foreign currency from oil and gas. That's the economy. It's a blow to the economy. And secondly, there's nowhere to put the gas, so they'll have to shut down the wells. And a shut-in well, it will then take several years to either reopen it or flare it off. That is flaring too. If you flare for a long time, let's say, it causes destruction here, a sort of triple effect. I would even put it that way. It's an immediate blow to the Russian economy, to the military, and to technological aspects, especially regarding the transfer and involvement of certain services in the placement of this gas. In other words, it's the right approach. This is when intelligence is at work. I always say when intelligence selects its own targets, as long as no one interferes with them. They pick out such key points that, if destroyed, either halt the entire technological production cycle or deliver several blows in multiple directions at once, like this LNG plant. And where exactly? All the way near Kazakhstan, not far from October, at least by those standards, so they made it there.
Roman Igorovich. An attack on the Druzhba oil pumping station. The largest oil pipeline hub near Bryansk is on fire. And can we say, as you always do, that a systemic collapse of Russia's oil infrastructure has begun? We're really trying to hit them hard.
Well, we can already say that because over the past 2 weeks, there have been specifically systematic, and that's important, systematic strikes on Russian oil pumping and oil refining on the oil and gas sector. The reason I emphasize this is that while it seems like a strike on the helium plant, in reality, it's a strike on gas processing, 15 billion cubic meters. Plus, if we list the most recent strikes, for example, oil refineries, Novokuybishevsky, Ryazansky, Afipsky, Saratovsky, Ukhtinsky. And so there were strikes on Wednesday, there were strikes on the Novoshakhtinsky and Volgograd oil refineries. Strikes on oil refineries, so this is definitely systematic, plus a strike on Unecha. Remember, about Unecha, we talked with you for years about its scale. So Unecha is already 40 kilometers from the LPDS. Unecha is on the Druzhba oil pipeline. It's an oil pipeline. It's called Druzhba. Yes, that's the Bryansk region. And the oil that's pumped, mainly Tatarstan oil, on the Druzhba pipeline, 300,000 barrels of oil pass through Unecha every day. That's $18 million every single day. The Russian economy receives this money from selling that oil. After Unecha, the oil continues on its way. There it passes through Mamai. Mamai is nearby, which is also another pumping station. Then the oil splits off, meaning the pipeline branches toward Ust-Luga near St. Petersburg. That's where the Russian so-called shadow fleet, the tanker fleet, is loaded. Part of the pipeline goes to Belarus, branching off again to the Naftan refinery, the Belarusian oil refinery, and to the Mosir refinery. From Mosir, the pipeline branches again, heading toward Poland and Germany. All of this oil, everything that passes through Unecha is what was hit today. And part of the pipeline, together with the refined oil in the form of diesel. Two pipelines run, the diesel product pipeline and the Druzhba oil pipeline, both go through Ukraine. We pump them to Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, but the Czech Republic has already refused oil. Russian oil was brought in, and an Italian oil pipeline was laid. So there is a gradual rejection of Russian oil. Nevertheless, a strike on Unecha brings everything to a halt. pretty much this entire cluster. If we finish off Uneka, this time we struck it for the first time during this operation, apparently unsuccessfully since there was no confirmation of a fire. Although the technological cycle of chemical analysis checks, the oil process was stopped. Today's strike, or yesterday's, you could say, this strike has already inflicted some damage, but not far, just 40 kilometers away. So basically, if we've started, believe me, it will burn. Anecha will burn, but in order to completely stop the oil flow, you need to destroy 3 in a row. Oil pumping stations. So we need to work on Mame, starting with the Steel Horse. If you remember, we talked about this 6 months ago. The Steel Horse, that's over there in the Bryansk area. The Steel Horse, Desna, Unesha. And in the Mame area, all of this needs to be taken out. And then it will be possible to completely stop the oil flow through the Druzhba pipeline. I think that's how it will be. In other words, we have the opportunity. The main thing is that the operations aren't tied up by various mechanisms like they were at the beginning of the year. When they started, by the way, with that same Unecha, strikes were carried out on Unecha and the Steel Horse on the Desna and Unecha. That was around February or March. They were good strikes, but then in March we were stopped.
Roman Igorovich, we've analyzed the strikes on the oil refineries in Volgograd, in Krasnodar Krai, in Slavyansk, in Kuban, and the simultaneous attacks on all these regions. Roman Igorovich, what does this indicate, and to what extent are we really able to attack the fuel market and military supplies in Russia? So how exactly will these strikes affect the fuel market and military supplies in Russia?
I've already listed them. All 7 of those Russian oil refineries are million-ton plants. There are about 30 of these million-ton plants in Russia, maybe a little more than 30, but that's it, not that many. There are another 50 small ones, but those are just small fry. Basically, they're more like moonshine stills. But the real million-ton plants, there are about 30 to 35 of them. And you could say, we've already hit 7 of them. That's a quarter or a fifth to a quarter, depending on which ones are operating. And in terms of production volume, we can completely shut down all Russian oil refining. And if oil refining stops, oil production will stop too. Halting oil production will lead to the shutting down of oil wells. There are thousands of them, but still they'll have nowhere to send the oil. They'll have to shut them down. Reopening a shut-in well is a gamble. Sometimes you have to, so that everything settles down there, because there are certain factors related to water injection, but those are technological cycles. That's why strikes on oil refineries are very important for us. In other words, first you have to take out the refineries. Hitting the refineries will impact the Russian economy and lead to the beginning of Russia's collapse. That's the only way to defeat Russia. And naturally, the fuel that was supposed to go to the Russian army simply won't get there. It won't be produced. Strikes on the plants that produce are especially important. Aviation kerosene. By the way, the first 2 plants, Novokuybishevsky and Ryazansky, they produce aviation kerosene. Or rather, they used to produce aviation kerosene, and the targets were chosen correctly. In other words, the targets were chosen correctly. The main thing now is not to stop, so that now in the near future, this whole bunch trying to tie the hands of our armed forces over the collapse of the Russian Empire doesn't force us to stop striking the oil refineries by pushing for some kind of air ceasefire or something else. Half a year of this kind of work. Look, 7 oil refineries in 2 weeks. By the end of the year, the Russians won't have a single one left, and we'll get to Omsk as well. If we've already reached Orenburg near Kazakhstan, then believe me, we have a lot of acquaintances in Kazakhstan who will at least help us get to Omsk too. Omsk is the largest. They process 21 million tons per year.
Roman Igorovich, the Russian government has banned the export of petroleum products because of Ukrainian drone attacks on oil refineries.
That's right, it's a double blow again. First, what did the ban on gasoline exports lead to? To a decrease in foreign currency earnings for the Russian economy. It's a blow, definitely a blow. It seemed like it was just 2 plants that got hit then, Novokuybishevsky and Ryazansky, and they immediately made the decision because Novokuybishevsky processes 7 million tons per year and Ryazansky about 15 to 17 million tons. So that's like one Omsk, like one big Russian plant. Naturally, this shortage was immediately felt. And especially, why does the shortage have such an impact? Because the Russian movement began. An army on the move consumes a huge amount of fuel. Naturally, there isn't enough either for the army or for the harvest that's underway or for the civilian population. Naturally, it was necessary to make the decision to restrict gasoline exports, and immediately gasoline prices started to rise, at least on the markets, on the big markets, on the wholesale markets. And that's already an indicator that there is a real gasoline shortage, and it's definitely going to continue in the future. Moreover, it is precisely the gasoline shortage that could lead to serious stagnation of the Russian economy through inflation, because 50, sometimes 70% of the price of Russian goods is actually the cost of delivery. That is the price of gasoline itself. Naturally, if gasoline starts getting more expensive, then consumer goods will also start to rise in price for Russians. And Russians live by their TV and their refrigerator. And then this herd, if they open the fridge and see nothing there, just a fig with poppy seeds. Well, they'll lick the poppy seeds, sure, and just look at the fig. They'll start mooing, and not just mooing, they'll start looking for horns somewhere, ready to butt heads. That's a big problem for Putin. What he fears most, by the way, is when the Russian mooing, bleating herd starts looking for something to eat, because their salaries just aren't enough to fill the fridge. And you can't really feed people with a TV. You can only feed their brains, but the stomach, well, it has nothing to do with the TV.
Roman Grigorievich, last night more than 100 drones attacked occupied Crimea. There is information that the Scala M radar in Crimea was destroyed, which means the loss of the ability to control up to 350 kilometers of airspace. And what does this now mean for the defense of occupied Crimea and the use of Russian aviation, Roman Grigorievich?
There is not just one radar like that there. These are radars of the enemy's radio technical troops. Several of them are destroyed each week, maybe 3 to 5, that's for sure. So on one hand, there is a systematic clearing of Crimea going on, and on the other hand, a rather interesting action is being carried out. After we destroy the radars, the Russians take those radars and anti-aircraft missile systems, say, from some oil refinery and transfer them to Crimea. Crimea is their priority. And naturally, you don't have to run all over Russia destroying every air defense system. You can just focus on Crimea and they'll bring them there themselves, just like in Chornobyivka. So it's like a big Chornobyivka. How many times was it? 30 times they hit the Russian troops with new strikes in Chornobyivka. So these strikes. So it's the same picture here in Crimea. You can focus on destroying the entire enemy air defense system. Through Crimea, they'll bring it there themselves, leave their rear areas exposed, but they'll try to protect Crimea, the Kerch Bridge. Today's strike on Crimea, which we're talking about now, is exactly one of those attacks. Moreover, it was a large-scale attack. Not only the radar was hit. The strikes were mainly carried out on Feodosia, on the Kerch Bridge, and in the area around the Kerch Bridge, and on the Port Kavkaz, which is near the Kerch Bridge and is used for transferring firstly in Kerch. Fuel is pumped into Crimea there. They have pumps installed. And of course, there are railway ferries that also go to Crimea. They are loaded on the Caucasus side, then travel by rail and are unloaded in the Kerch area. So this is a massive strike on Crimea. I think within a day, the General Staff will confirm it after decoding the information. Means of over-the-horizon surveillance or sinters at the very least will show where the strikes were delivered. But the strike was serious, meaning it hit Feodosia and some military facilities in the port of Kavkaz.
Roman Nikolaevich, today I watched a report related to occupied Crimea, and it said that the Gauleiters, the occupiers, the occupation authorities made a statement that now there will be no mobile connection or internet at all in the territory of occupied Crimea for a very long time. This is being done so that they can fight against the drones of the armed forces of Ukraine. So now they've shut down mobile connection and internet on the occupied peninsula. Mobile internet, what does this indicate?
They're afraid right now at this very moment. Why are they doing this? From a military logic standpoint, that's exactly what it is. Why? Because there is a certain protocol for protecting high-risk sites, as they call it, like the Kerch Bridge. In order to fully secure it, for example, from reconnaissance or from targeting adjustments, they shut down all communications. Naturally, right now, the highest security protocol for the Kerch Bridge has been activated, and they will shut everything down. Everyone there will be marching in formation on the parade ground for these few days until Friday, and most likely even after Friday, it will continue until Monday. Because starting a drinking binge on Friday, like Russians usually do, won't be possible this time. That's why I think they'll keep the Crimean bridge under this kind of secrecy mode, at least maximum security measures until Monday. We'll see. But the thing is, we don't always use Russian communications either. There are other mechanisms.
Tamarin Gorky, the second strike on the Shahed storage facility in Tatarstan, we managed to do it again in just a few days. A repeated hit on a target 1,300 kilometers from Ukraine. At this point, how does this demonstrate the capabilities of long-range drones and their strategic impact?
By the way, judging by the video, I should say these are already new drones. These are already drones like the Iranian Russian or the Iranian Shahed or the Chinese Sunflower 200. In other words, it's a wing-type drone. This means we've already set up serial production. At least at their own base, the SBU guys have set up the production of pretty decent drones by and large. The thing is, it's precisely the wing configuration that allows, if there's enough fuel and a good engine, to send these drones several thousand kilometers. It all depends on the reliability of the engine and the amount of fuel. So they've gone into this area correctly, they've taken the right approach. Fixed wing type drones are, of course, better used at short ranges. Well, at least that's how we use the Barbers, right? Or the same goes for the Liutyi and 196. That is, a fixed wing type is very easy to shoot down, meaning its speed is still lower, but the wing can be accelerated to good speeds. Eventually, you could even install not just an internal combustion engine there, but also put in a turbine without significantly changing the configuration of the aircraft itself. So this is thinking ahead. They started thinking about it, and basically, if the SBU is working on this, believe me, they're doing a great job in this regard. Well, first of all, regarding target designation and carrying out combat missions, they've made significant progress, as well as in the production of this type of drone. And as for the Garand drones being Russian-Chinese now, because they're Russian-Chinese, they can produce a huge number of them. So what is a Garand? Right now, a Garand, it's a body cast in Russia, the body is Russian, and the engine. The Chinese have already set up a factory in Russia, an internal combustion engine plant, although for now, the internal combustion engine is produced in Russia, while the turbines are still made by the Chinese for the Garand 3. Most of the components and assemblies, especially the servos and some control systems, are Chinese. Over 50% of it is Chinese, and the main board is produced worldwide. That's the progress in control systems. This is what a Garand is. And now they've started producing a huge number of them. They produce 150 to 200 per day. About 100 are used against us. So about 100 are being stockpiled on their side. These warehouses were identified by the security service and drones were sent there. As for the extent of the damage, I think confirmation will come in some time, but we have to keep working. Even if it's 1,500 kilometers away, some drones will make it through. The main thing is to scale up production and keep hitting them constantly. Believe me, this issue can be solved. We can reduce the number of Garand drones in the warehouses and then eventually get to the production sites themselves. Because we need to take out the production facilities, and not just in Russia. Because without destroying the production in China, we won't reach a certain level. In the end, even if we destroy all the production in Russia, they'll just move it to China and start bringing in Chinese drones.
Roman Lvovich, here's some fresh information that confirms your words. Bloomberg, they report that the Saratov oil refinery has stopped accepting oil after the latest drone attack. This could affect gasoline supplies. The situation is dire. It belongs to Rosneft. Roman Igorovich, please comment.
This plant used to process 7 million tons of oil. The Saratov refinery is on the banks of the Volga, so it's between. The Volga divides it, so you have Saratov and Yelts. On one side to the west is Saratov, on the left bank, and Yelts is to the east. And this plant was right on the bank of the Volga. Naturally, it was only a matter of time before we reached it. The main thing is they gave the order when they finally allowed us to strike, as they say. The question of why it was forbidden before is a different matter. That's Article 111 of the Criminal Code. And after the strikes began, of course, the Saratov oil refinery immediately came under attack. And it's not going anywhere. It's been standing there for 90 years. This plant is 90 years old. If I remember correctly, this plant is called creaking. It was only a matter of time before it was hit, and once it was, its task was accomplished by force. Unmanned systems will help a panel from without Nika. Ours are with them too. Article A and 196 is exactly about those fierce Antonov drones that struck and completely shut it down. So you could say at least 7 million tons for the Russians. Now they'll be wondering what to do with it. And most likely, since they can't send extra oil to foreign markets now, they'll start shutting down their extraction infrastructure. And a shortage of gasoline. This plant mainly produced gasoline and diesel. And naturally, this gasoline and diesel isn't reaching either the domestic market or the foreign market because it's shut down. Not even the Russian army. Granted, it didn't really supply Moscow much, but to cut off, say, fuel supplies to Moscow and the Moscow region, you'd have to shut down 2 more plants. But if you shut down a plant, who supplies it? Mainly, it's the Kapotnya oil refinery. It supplies almost half of the gasoline and diesel for Moscow and the Moscow region. And if we really finish it off, if we take out this oil pipeline all along the line and shut it down, then the Moza oil refinery, the other half of the fuel for Moscow, was supplied by Belarus, the Moza oil refinery. Muscovites, besides not being able to fly out, now won't even be able to leave by other means. So just imagine, it's the velvet season and they're sitting somewhere in Moscow's basements.
Roman Igorovich, a very important topic is the enemy's offensive, the enemy's advance near Dobropolye, and the threat of encirclement of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. Let's start with Dobropolye, a breakthrough of 15 to 18 kilometers, the capture of Kucheryav Yar and Zolotoy Kolodets. At this point, is this a local tactical operation or the beginning of a major enemy offensive?
The thing is, when carrying out the tasks of the first wave, which are shaping operations, so-called reconnaissance by combat, attempts to break through the front lines, the second wave then moves in afterward. The second wave, which is now starting to arrive, we can already see it, equipment, ammunition, personnel, all fresh, so to speak. They can move into the breakthrough if it is achieved. And then they can advance into open operational space where, as they say, it's a free-for-all, go wherever you want, as far as you can, until you run out of fuel. So this breakthrough does not exist right now, because everyone keeps saying, breakthrough, breakthrough, but no, there is no operational breakthrough. What we have is operational infiltration through our positions. But why is it called operational infiltration? Why did it happen? Because we don't have enough troop density along the line of contact, especially on the main section from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka. Well, it's not enough. Everyone understands that perfectly well. Roughly speaking, there should be 3 strong points per kilometer, meaning a company should cover a kilometer. Sometimes in our case, a company covers several kilometers and there's only 1 strong point over several kilometers. Naturally, between these platoon strong points, the Russians can slip through in sufficient numbers to then build up their forces somewhere in the rear and cause chaos at distances of 10 to 15 kilometers. So in this way, they broke through, but not in the sense of a full breakthrough. No one saw them, they slipped through. They slipped through and then started causing trouble in the rear, as they say, which led Deep State to draw a map showing a breakthrough as such. There was no breakthrough, and at the moment, a decision has been made. Reserves are being transferred there to plug the gaps in this direction. How long have we been talking about this? We've been talking about this for 3 months. A decision needs to be made. Sersky needed to make a decision not to run around the Sumy, Kursk, Kharkiv, and Belgorod regions, but to focus on the Eastern Front. Why? Because the main objective for the Russians is to capture Donetsk region. Naturally, they will put pressure on Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, because without Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, they can't get to Dobropilya, and without Dobropilya, eventually they'll move from the west already toward toward Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and Druzhkivka. In other words, this operation is obvious, it's right there on the map. And our third line of defense was holding the Russians back quite well, until Sirsky started reducing the troop density. Why he started to reduce it, let them figure that out themselves. Whether politicians told him to, or he came up with it himself, decided to drop out or just stupidly surrender. Donbass, I don't know why. But based on the inaction, I'll say it again, if we hadn't been talking about this for 3 months, maybe it wouldn't be worth mentioning now. But for 3 months, in almost every broadcast, we said that in order to hold the Eastern Front, it was necessary to increase troop density by bringing in law enforcement forces. Well, every stream we talk about this. So what happened? In the end, they put the law enforcement officers into action and sent them there. The National Guard of Ukraine, the National Guard, are law enforcement. The National Guard belongs to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. The Ministry of Internal Affairs needs to act. They have 1,300, we have 1,100. We need the armed forces of Ukraine. And that's it. There will be no more questions. There won't be these breakthroughs. Well, it's not a breakthrough. I'll say it again. It's infiltration. It's infiltration that our people just didn't notice. They simply didn't notice it. And then when they showed up in the rear, that's when they started to address these issues. It's about the same situation as, remember, with Lapti and Aladin, when they once said they didn't notice the Ukrainian troops that got into their rear last year in Kursk. This was exactly the same kind of tactical infiltration. In other words, there weren't enough Lapti and Aladin along the borderline. Our troops slipped through between them, and then they were simply crushed from the rear. They were pressed down, and a breakthrough began. So to prevent such a breakthrough is better not to allow it in the first place. That is, immediately increase the troop density along the Donetsk front. The Russians won't launch any more offensives anywhere else. Not on a large scale. Nowhere except the Donetsk and part of the Zaporizhzhia front. Why do they need to expand the land corridor even further? Why is Putin now demanding that we withdraw ourselves from the Donetsk direction?
Roman Igorovich, you just spoke very concisely, but I would like you to articulate this specifically, especially for our audience, for whom this is very important, about the threat of encirclement of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. So what is the danger for the armed forces of Ukraine in this sector?
If we allow the encirclement of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, that is, if they push us out from this direction, then they will have what is called operational space practically all the way to Pavlograd. In the Petrovsk region, and in reality, there is operational space all the way to the Dnipro. That's why, for example, when the Poles talk about reaching the Dnipro, they mean the Dnipro River, because they could advance not only toward Pavlograd, toward the Dnipro, they could move toward Kremenchuk, toward Poltava. In other words, from the left bank, basically wherever they want. It's practically all flatland there. That is the third ridge, the last ridge, the so-called Donetsk ridge. This is the third line of defense, which our forces are currently holding in the area of Pokrovsk, from Pokrovsk toward Konstantinovka. If you let them through there, nothing will stop them except the Dnipro, meaning the Dnipro River. Why are the Poles now building up their defense system? You know, not along the border with, say, Belarus or even the Kaliningrad region, but along the Vistula. There it's also a flat surface, just one obstacle. In reality, it's the Vistula, and that's why on the western bank of the Vistula, they're building a certain defensive system there, and they're doing the right thing, by the way. That's exactly it. That's the right move. So we cannot allow the Russians to break through the third line of defense. Otherwise, we'll have to chase them on the right bank of the Dnipro later. They're already milling around on the left bank near Kherson. In other words, it's a very dangerous situation at the moment. And why did we keep saying for 3 months, not for nothing, telling you to stop running around? Around Sumy, around Kursk, the Russians aren't going to come from Kursk towards Sumy and Kiev. Don't believe those crazy deputies who've already worn their arms down to the elbows digging Kiev's defense system. There's no need to dig in around Kiev. They won't make it to Kiev. Pull those deputies back and let the Verkhovna Rada focus on passing better laws. Otherwise, in their foolishness, they'll end up digging all the way to the center of the earth. They actually started digging around Kiev, and these are our military comrades after all. Well, not exactly military, I mean, so there's no need to run anywhere. All of this is just noise grenades, so-called diversionary maneuvers. That goes for Kharkiv, by the way, and for Kherson too. It's the same kind of conflict. But the real pressure from the Russians will be focused on breaking through the third line of defense to capture the Donetsk front lines. And that's where they're concentrating. That's what Syrskyi needs to be told, I don't know, 5 times over. What do you mean? Explain it to him. Do you think he doesn't understand? He's just as much a military man as I am. He understands this perfectly well. Any lieutenant understands this. Anyone who has seen a topographic map, just looked at the elevation map, seen the deployment of forces and assets on both sides, immediately understands where one side will advance and what the other side needs to do. And if Syrskyi understands this and isn't acting, then it means he's not doing it for some reason of his own or because of political orders he's receiving from the top. So let them figure it out themselves. But as for Donbass, we won't let you surrender it, comrades from the Green Party.
Dear audience, please like this video and write a few kind words in the comments to support Ukraine and its armed forces. Roman Hryhorovich and I are working for you, for audiences all over the world, so that they know the truth about Russian aggression and Russia's war against Ukraine. The well-known military analyst Roman Svitin. Roman Hryhorovich, thank you, and as always, see you this Friday.
Goodbye.